Police officers and medics are crucial for any society, but hundreds of them are being lured from the UK to Australia and elsewhere. Is the UK now suffering a brain drain of some of its most important workers? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, British doctors, nurses, rail workers and others have all gone on strike this year as they try to cope with soaring inflation. So it's little wonder that hundreds of skilled professionals are voting with their feet and leaving the country. Many are willing to travel thousands of miles. Just how will the UK cope?
We will be targeting the entire UK, Ireland and New Zealand with this new campaign, with this Labor agreement.
This is Western Australia. It's about as far as one can get from British shores, and yet the government here is actively recruiting police officers from the UK.
I look back and I say to myself, I would probably have never have had the same opportunities I would have had if I was still a police officer in London.
According to a statement earlier this year by the national chair of the UK's Police Federation, 9 police officers a day are submitting requests to transfer to a police force on the other side of the world. And he says record numbers are resigning over inadequate pay and conditions. And it's not just police officers. Doctors, nurses, other medical professionals and teachers have gone on strike this year for more money.
Western Australia, be part of this team. And this one. Be there for this. And this.
And once again, Western Australia has been on a charm offensive to encourage disenchanted British medics to emigrate. Although immigration has been growing faster than the rate of increase in people leaving the country, emigration has been on a steady rise since 2016, when the UK voted to leave the European Union. And even though wages have risen, soaring inflation caused by a combination of COVID-era supply chain crunches, Brexit and the war in Ukraine have left many workers feeling poorer than ever. So will more people be tempted to skip the UK for opportunities elsewhere?
Well, let's meet our guests. Alia Butt is a psychotherapist with the UK's National Health Service and has been campaigning for pay rises and better conditions for NHS staff. In Perth, in Western Australia, is Ollie Peterson, journalist, broadcaster and host of Perth Live on 6PR, which is one of the best radio stations in Australia. And in Suffolk, in the UK, is political economist Anne Pettifor. Her latest book is The Case for the Green New Deal. Ollie, I'll come to you first. Just paint us a picture as we head into winter here in the UK. Paint us a picture of life in Australia for people who do relocate. What's the Australian lifestyle like?
Well, Enda, as you say, you're heading into winter, we're heading into summer, and Christmas in Australia in particular, having barbecues, there is no better place to be. And the pictures which will stream around the world is the greatest opportunity to recruit people to come and live here in Australia. And right now, this is a great opportunity to move to Australia, and there's a very aggressive campaign underway, particularly in the UK, to encourage Brits to move to Australia. Because, Enda, you can live in a place like I live in Perth in Western Australia, and you can live on the beach. You can wake up in the morning, you can jump into the ocean, you can cool down, you can go for a lovely walk along the coast, and there's not really anyone else bothering you as you discover the wonderful west coast of Australia. And then you're about a 20 to 30 minute commute into work. So there are so many opportunities, Enda. There are jobs aplenty in Australia at the moment. We have the lowest unemployment rate in Australia that we've had in some time. It's almost full employment. And we're after anyone and everybody to come and move here to Australia. It is the best place in the world. Perth in particular, Australia's best kept secret. So it's going to be hard to beat.
And the best place in the world to live. How on earth can the UK keep its people when you hear adverts like this for Australia?
Well, I'm very happy for Ollie, and I'm so glad that he's so proud of his country. But I must say that, the images that we've been getting of a very hot Australia and an Australia that suffered, wildfires and people having to go into the sea to be protected from fires and so on. I just think we should put it into context, really. So climate change is hitting Australia quite hard, and I don't think we should forget that, even amidst all the joy and the barbecues and the fun and the games. That's true.
But Anne, on a really serious note for the UK, should Britain be really worried about this brain drain now? Because we're seeing doctors, nurses, police officers, they're all making a beeline for Australia.
Yeah. No, I think we should be extremely worried. And I know of some brilliant surgeons and so on looking to go to Australia, but not wanting to really, wanting to serve the NHS. But the NHS has decided that it will disincentivize such people like that. And that's entirely our own fault. This is a major self-inflicted wound by the British government. And it was a wound that was first pierced, if I may use a dreadful term, back in 2010, when George Osborne embarked on a program of slashing public spending. He used the flawed argument of blaming the public sector for the great financial crisis, left the finance sector intact without any changes to regulation or anything to manage the financial system, instead attacked the public sector and blamed the public sector for high levels of sovereign debt. Now, those high levels of sovereign debt were incurred because of the failure of the financial system and therefore the economic system. So it was completely sort of ideological to use the act as an opportunity to smash up public services. And we're living with the consequences. George Osborne is long gone. He's probably got a peerage somewhere. He's probably earning an enormous amount of money, being paid by Wall Street or whatever. I'm not quite sure where he is, but we are left with the shambles that is our public services policy at the moment, and in particular the tragedy of the National Health Service and low pay there, and therefore unhappy staff who went to all kinds of lengths to protect us during the COVID crisis. So this is a self-inflicted wound, and it wasn't necessary. It's not at all, and in economic terms, it was entirely unnecessary.
Alia, you're passionate about the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. How much does it pain you to see the state it's in and its best talent heading off to a new life in Australia?
It's very difficult, and I think, I would agree with Anne. It's very depressing to see what's happened to the National Health Service over a decade of underfunding, this drive to privatise the NHS. We went into the pandemic very, very understaffed, under-resourced. We then saw a horrible crisis, very unprecedented, break down the NHS even further, break down the staff even further, lots of trauma, lots of people leaving the NHS, therefore, significantly more understaffed. And now people are saying we need to be paid properly. People are leaving the NHS. 1 in 10 new doctors wanting to leave the NHS, wanting to emigrate. We have 2.9 doctors per 1,000 people in this country. It's completely unsustainable. It's no wonder that people don't want to work here anymore, because it's so tragically difficult. And I think the main point that I'd like to make is that our patients are the ones who are suffering. And that's the most difficult thing to watch, and to actually not be able to give care. When I was doing some reading about this brain drain and trying to understand it more, it was very clear that that is actually what is driving people to places like Australia, where you can actually provide a decent level of care, when you can actually give therapy properly and look after people in the way that we should be doing all across the world, really.
Tell me, the British Medical Association have described this as an exodus. Is that a fair description?
I think it's getting that way. I think, people are being incentivised, and, I think both of the previous guests made a point to this. We are being de-incentivised in the UK, in Britain. We are being told we are worthless. We don't need to be paid. Our patients aren't important. The NHS isn't important. People who deserve and require healthcare can only get it if they have enough money. That's perverse, and I think a lot of the public in this country find it perverse as well. I don't think we support this idea that the NHS isn't important. I think a lot of people are given the wrong impression about what's happening in the NHS, and actually the drive to privatise the NHS, which is what we saw ramped up over the COVID pandemic, again, disturbingly ramped up, and money going to people who don't need it, who don't know how to use it, and who certainly don't support the NHS. So, you know, people are leaving the NHS, and staff are fed up, stressed, upset and confused, I think.
Ollie, paint us a picture, if you will, of the Australian healthcare system. What are your hospitals like in Perth, in towns and cities across Australia? They're obviously better.
Look, they are to some extent. I think the pressures that the health systems in Australia are currently facing do mirror a little of what you are discussing here in the UK. Obviously, we didn't get hit with COVID, and we didn't have the death toll or the courageous shifts that nurses and doctors had to pull as you did in the UK. I'm not trying to walk away from that, but there is certainly a brain drain in Australia as well, and the competition for places, even amongst the states and the territories for doctors and nurses. But again, Enda, I think here the problem that you're facing in the UK and you're facing around the world is the competition for places, the money that's available to pay doctors and nurses. And this is where lifestyle obviously comes into the equation. We might not be able to pay people a lot more than what they're worth, and they should be worth a lot more. We shouldn't even be questioning those sorts of issues. But if you can move to a country like Australia, you can have a lifestyle like we live here in Perth. It's about everything else that adds up. So in terms of the cost of housing, the cost of transport, the cost of schooling, and the opportunities that your children will have to grow up in a lifestyle where mum or dad might be only commuting 20 minutes to work as opposed to 2 hours each way, and not having to work double or triple shifts. I mean, those sorts of scenarios that we're painting there, you can't put a price on that. And I don't think there is probably a monetary benefit to be gained from that when we have governments around the world all tightening the purse strings because they're saying they basically broke from COVID. The hospital system in Australia, though, we are under immense pressure. You understand that elective surgeries here, if you have a knee replacement, a hip replacement in the public system, you're having to wait up to 2 or 3 years. In countries like Australia, that shouldn't be happening. It shouldn't be happening in the UK either. But there is a lot of strain and pressure on our health system, as there has been in the UK, but nowhere near to the extreme lengths that there have been in the UK. And I think that is why you're seeing such an aggressive approach from both the federal government here in Australia and as well the state and territory governments to look to Brits to say, hey, here's opportunities to fill the jobs that are available in healthcare in Australia. Here's the money we offer you. Here's what the price of a house is. Here's what you can do to be able to send your children to school. And when you do the maths, you think, hey, there's another opportunity here. I can get out of the rat race. I can be valued. And again, I can be enjoying summer in Australia, not worrying about the wet days, the cold days, the short days of the year. Enda, the opportunities here in Australia, they just know no end.
And can I ask you, is this almost another byproduct of the cost of living crisis in the United Kingdom, that we're seeing police officers, nurses working every hour God sends, and they're simply not able to make ends meet? And they're having conversations about, shall we just go?
So the point is this, that, you know, we can have a very long discussion about this. And I would frankly like to open up the discussion and say that it's really about the whole way in which the global economic system is now structured. It's by no accident that we have a global market for labor, a global market for doctors, because the view was that if you globalized markets, if you opened up markets worldwide, then you could bring down wages, you could bring down salaries, and that's been the effect, no question about it. In real terms, wages have been falling in most of the big so-called advanced economies for more than 10 years now. And so there's that ideology. Then there's the ideology of governments mustn't be involved at all in the management of markets, and in particular in the management of commodity markets. So commodity markets which are global and which are headquartered in, for example, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange or the New York Mercantile Exchange or the London Metals Exchange, those global markets determine the price of very important commodities for us. Energy on the one hand, food and grains on the other hand. Now, those markets are supposedly, according to traditional orthodox economists, dependent on supply and demand to fix the price. But we also know that swishing around in the global economy are trillions, not billions, trillions of dollars of money. That includes, for example, all of those privatized pension funds, all the asset management funds, the hedge funds, the insurance companies. They've all got trillions of dollars of money with nowhere to go, essentially. And they will only go to places where they can earn very high rates of return. And the highest rates of return are in the global commodity markets. And last year, when Russia, Ukraine, there was a panic. There was a fear that we'd run out of oil or gas and we'd run out of grain. So for a moment, there was a panic and supply and demand did play a role. But very quickly, it was extraordinary how quickly the market rebalanced, and the Americans found they had a reserve, an oil reserve, which they could share, and they had quantities of gas that they could export and so on, and grain was found from elsewhere. And pretty soon, the market balanced. But thanks to speculation on the global markets, the price of those commodities continued to rise. Now, what has happened is that central banks, rather than attending to those markets and asking why they were so dysfunctional in a moment of grave crisis and why they inflicted this inflationary problem on all of us, instead the central banks have turned on doctors, nurses, bus drivers, individuals, families, and said, you're going to pay the price for this. You know, we've got to bring down inflation, and we blame you for over-consuming. We blame you for exceeding your capacity to consume, right? And we know it's your fault, and that's why we've hiked up interest rates to cut your consumption.
Alia, what are people, staff, your colleagues, saying to you in terms of paying bills, paying mortgages? Everything has got so expensive in the UK. Just talk me through morale, because in the pandemic, every Thursday night, people in the UK were out clapping. But rounds of applause don't pay the bills.
I remember that, and I remember the first time it happened, I was quite excited, and very quickly that feeling dissipated, and it almost began to feel like a slap in the face when we had a government refusing to be responsible in their response, I would say, to the COVID crisis, refusing to provide us with proper PPE. We had the highest number of health worker deaths in the entire of Europe. We lost a lot of people because the government wanted to prioritise profit over people. It's exactly like Anne has been saying. The wrong group of people are being targeted. And I think the government knows exactly what it's doing in this respect. They're targeting ordinary people, saying your wages are the problem. We haven't had a wage rise overall, I would say. You know, the working class people, workers, the people at the front line doing the most kind of everyday back-breaking work and risk-taking work have had their wages suppressed. Where there is money being made, you know, wealth disparity in this country has increased to an obscene level, the biggest increase over the history of kind of statistics, actually. That's really quite a huge amount of money being accrued at the top. And to say, as Anne said, to say that you know, nurses, teachers, doctors are the people who should be paying, it's really, really deplorable. So, you know, we are living in a cost of living crisis. Really, I would say it's a cost of greed crisis. And actually, all the staff, there's no group of staff that I've spoken to who are saying, you know what, it's okay. I can put food on the table. I can even put the heating on. Nobody can. Everyone is struggling in the NHS. There is no group of staff members who is not struggling. We are seeing consultants moonlighting because they can, so they will make more money. And that money is being taken out of the NHS as well, because that's privatisation, outsourcing. It costs us more money, and it's a huge problem.
Ollie, just talk us through what working life is like then for doctors and nurses in a city like Perth. I mean, we all hear about cost of living crisis, but I'm guessing life is probably better in Australia. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is fair. It is fair, Andrew. I mean, there's still the similar pressures on doctors and nurses in a city like Perth as well, because we could always do with more. And we have been through, you know, similar scenarios here in Perth where Nurses have had to work double shifts, triple shifts. Our nurses as well are currently fighting in the middle of a pay rise battle as well, looking for 5% when government policy is only 3%. It's been a very long and protracted negotiation because similarly their wages are not rising. Now, these are the people that obviously didn't think twice through the pandemic years when all of a sudden restrictions were placed on our lives, and the fact that people still turned up to hospital and got sick, they still went to work. They still rolled up their sleeves and went to work every day. But I would say that the picture that you paint in the UK and what we have seen again here on our television screens and read in the media, that working in an Australian hospital or in the healthcare system in Australia would be, dare I say it, a little bit easier than it would be in the UK. And there would be a greater sense of value, and converting the money again from Australian dollars to UK pounds, all of a sudden it does look like a very attractive opportunity for many Brits. So look, there again, plenty of opportunities, difficulties that we have as well, attracting staff into the regions of Australia. You've got to remember we are such a big, broad land that might be working in regional Western Australia or the regions of the Northern Territory and be, half a day to a day away's drive away from, if not even a flight that comes every couple of days to a capital city. So, healthcare in Australia, it is challenging. I'm not going to say it's easy, but I think the scenario and the picture that's been painted out of what's happened to the NHS in the UK versus what's happening here in Australia, we are still probably pound for pound a little ahead of where the UK is. And that's again why you can understand that Australia is becoming such an attractive opportunity for the brain drain out of Britain.
And if you were advising Rishi Sunak and his cabinet, what would you say to them? What's the first thing you'd ask them to do to address this issue?
It makes complete economic sense for the government to raise the wages of nurses, doctors and consultants. Why does it make sense? Because that investment in our health sector is good for people who are sick, it's good for the doctors, but above all, it's good for the budget. Because the more people earn, the more they're likely to pay in taxes, the more they're likely to spend and therefore pay in VAT. The more they're likely to go on holidays and pay. and there's all kinds of fees and taxes that the government can collect, but it can only collect those taxes from people on decent wages. And right now, the British economy is structured to have very low incomes, very insecure jobs, a lot of part-time work. And that's so bad for the government's budget, because the government isn't collecting the tax revenues it needs to balance the budget. If they increased wages and salaries, they would increase their own income, plus they would increase the income of the doctors, the nurses, and the other workers, but they would also increase the income of shopkeepers, for example, because people would be able to spend. So, it's very, very short-sighted of the government to say it's too expensive to pay decent wages. They're going to lose these doctors. And can I say, we mustn't over-egg the Australian story. It is a very small country, and therefore the numbers are very much lower than they are here. But the opportunities for innovation in Australia are minuscule compared to this country, simply because of our numbers, simply because of the scale of the investment here.
And
so I just want to bring that in.
I want to bring Alia back in. Alia, just tell me, hand on heart, can you see this getting better anytime soon for the United Kingdom and the National Health Service?
I think the only way that things are going to get better is if the government stops this drive to destroy the NHS that we've seen for over a decade, through reform, through policy, through, the health and care bill that is now going to make it far easier for American-style companies and privatised companies sitting on boards that make decisions about where money goes. That's incredibly unethical. So, unless the government stops trying to destroy the NHS so that we have an American-style insurance-based healthcare service, it is not going to get better. And if they do manage to do that entirely, more people are going to die significantly. More people are going to struggle to do their other jobs, because we must remember our patients in the NHS run the entire country. They are the people who work in the schools, who work in the offices, who work in the banks. Not everybody is going to be able to afford private healthcare. So unless the government really turns this around and starts properly funding the NHS, paying staff properly, and actually respecting national healthcare and healthcare free at the point of use.
Final question to you, Ollie. In Australia, how do British people fit into the Australian way of life then, in your experience?
Oh, they fit in exceptionally well, and there's lots of similarities, obviously, between Australia and the UK. As long as you support the Australian cricket team, you don't barrack for the Barmy Army, then you'll be okay. And we don't talk about rugby union in this country anymore either, because the Wallabies are no good. But look, there's lots of similarities, Anna. And just a quick point on Anne. Actually, Perth in Australia is the capital of the Southern Hemisphere for medical research. So we might be small in terms of medical research or size. You might think we're a big land, and I'll tell you what, some of the best researchers and doctors are calling Perth in Western Australia home. And I invite you to join us here as well.
Ollie, Anne, Alia, thank you all for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.